What if I told you that one man, completely surrounded by thousands of enemies, turned the tide of a war without lifting a single finger? Stay tuned to uncover this unbelievable story. Imagine standing face to face with an unstoppable army, certain that all hope is lost, until something happens that no one could explain. What did Elisha see that changed everything? And how did it bring an army to its knees without a single weapon raised? But here's the twist: this wasn't just a miraculous escape. It led to an even greater challenge, one that tested the faith and unity of an entire nation. What happened next will leave you stunned. Set in ancient Israel, a land teetering on the brink of war, this story isn't just about survival, it's about faith, unseen forces, and the power of mercy. Even today, its message rings true, offering hope and inspiration when we need it most. It was a time of shadows, a time when the people of Israel lived under the constant weight of fear. The sun would rise each morning, casting light over the hills, but that light brought no comfort. It only revealed the looming threat on the horizon, the kingdom of Aram. Ruthless, powerful, relentless. Aram was no ordinary enemy. Its army was vast, its soldiers battle-hardened, and its strategies unmatched. Town after town had fallen to their might, their banners flying high over lands drenched in blood. Entire villages had been burned to the ground, their people scattered or enslaved. Aram was a kingdom of conquest, and its king was a man of unquenchable ambition. He had one goal: to expand his empire until no one could challenge him. And now, his eyes were fixed on Israel. For Israel, the threat wasn't just military, it was existential. They were God's chosen people, yet they were small, vulnerable, and seemingly outmatched. Their armies paled in comparison to the hordes of Aram, their weapons no match for the polished steel of their enemies. The people of Israel prayed, day and night, for deliverance, clinging to their faith like a lifeline. But faith alone couldn't erase the fear that gripped their hearts. The tension was palpable. Stories of Aram's brutality spread like wildfire, carried by travelers and refugees who had seen the devastation firsthand. "They are unstoppable," they whispered. "No one can stand against them." The air was thick with dread as Israel's borders grew weaker with each passing day. It wasn't a matter of if Aram would attack, it was a matter of when. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, Israel had something that Aram could never understand. Something invisible. Something unshakable. They had their faith in the one true God. And more than that, they had a prophet, a man who carried God's voice, who walked in his power. His name was Elisha. And while the people of Israel clung to him as a symbol of hope, the king of Aram saw him as a threat. A threat that had to be eliminated at all costs. The story begins here, in a land teetering on the edge of destruction, where the clash between human ambition and divine intervention was about to unfold. It was a time of fear, but also a time of miracles, a time when the impossible became reality. In the midst of Israel's fear and uncertainty, there was one man who stood apart. Not because he was a king or a warrior, but because he was chosen by God. His name was Elisha, and he was no ordinary man. Elisha's journey had begun years earlier, as the disciple of Elijah, one of Israel's greatest prophets. Elijah had been a man of fire, a prophet who called down flames from heaven to prove the power of the one true God. When Elijah was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind, his mantle, his role as God's messenger, was passed to Elisha. And from that moment on, Elisha carried the weight of a divine calling. Elisha's life was marked by miracles. He wasn't just a prophet, he was a living testament to God's power. When a poor widow faced starvation, Elisha multiplied her oil, providing for her and her children. When a young boy died, Elisha prayed over him, and the child's breath returned. He purified poisoned water, fed 100 men with just a few loaves of bread, and even healed a foreign commander of leprosy. Wherever he went, miracles followed. But Elisha's greatest gift wasn't his ability to perform miracles. It was his faith. In a world filled with fear and doubt, Elisha stood firm, unshaken by the chaos around him. He trusted in God completely, and that trust made him fearless. He wasn't afraid of kings or armies. He wasn't afraid of death. And that made him dangerous to those who opposed him. To the people of Israel, Elisha was a symbol of hope, a reminder that God was still with them, even in their darkest hour. But to the king of Aram, he was a problem. A very big problem. You see, Elisha had a gift that no enemy could counter. He knew things. God revealed to him the plans of Aram's army, allowing Israel to evade their traps time and time again. No matter how secretive the Arameans were, their strategies always seemed to fail. It was as if someone was spying on them, listening to their every word. And in a way, someone was. Word of Elisha's abilities reached the ears of the Aramean king, and it infuriated him. How could one man cause so much trouble? How could Israel, a nation so small, continue to resist his advances? The king's frustration turned into obsession. He had to eliminate Elisha. He didn't just want to defeat Israel, he wanted to destroy the man who stood between him and total domination. But Elisha was no ordinary target. And the king was about to discover that going after God's prophet was a far greater challenge than he could ever imagine. The Aramean king's anger boiled over, and in his frustration, he sought answers from the gods of his people. But one night, as he lay in his royal chambers, sleep brought him a vision that he would never forget. In his dream, he saw a man standing on a mountaintop. The man was shrouded in light so brilliant that his face was obscured. Around him was an army, but not an ordinary army. These were warriors of fire, their chariots blazing with celestial flames. Their swords gleamed like lightning, and their presence was overwhelming. The king awoke with a start, his heart pounding. He could still see the image of the man and the fiery army in his mind. Who was he? What did the dream mean? As the king recounted his vision to his advisors, their whispers carried one name, Elisha. The king's fear turned to fury. If this dream was a warning, then the solution was clear. Elisha had to be stopped. Immediately. The king ordered his generals to prepare. He didn't care how many soldiers it took. He would hunt down this prophet and end his influence once and for all. But the king was about to discover that his dream was more than just a vision. It was a glimpse of the power he was up against. In the grand throne room of the Aramean palace, tension hung thick in the air. The king of Aram, a man known for his cunning and ruthlessness, stood before his council of generals, his face twisted with frustration. The room, usually filled with the sound of strategy discussions and battle plans, was now silent except for the king's heavy breathing. He had reached the end of his patience. How? He growled, his voice echoing off the stone walls. How does this keep happening? We outnumber them 10-1. We have superior weapons, seasoned soldiers, and flawless strategies. Yet every time we move, every time we strike, they are ready for us. Explain this to me. His gaze swept across the room, daring anyone to speak. But no one did. The generals, men hardened by years of battle, avoided his eyes, their silence betraying their unease. Finally, one man stepped forward, his voice cautious, as though afraid his words might ignite the king's fury. "Your Majesty," he began, choosing his words carefully, "it is said that the Israelites have a prophet, a man named Elisha. They believe he has the ability to hear things, to know things. Some say he even hears the words you speak in your most private moments." The king's expression darkened further. "A prophet?" He spat, his tone dripping with disdain. "You expect me to believe that a mere man, a prophet, can outwit the might of Aram? This is nonsense. Superstitious drivel." But even as he dismissed the idea, doubt crept into his mind. He thought back to the uncanny precision of Israel's defenses, the way they seemed to anticipate his every move. Could there be truth to these whispers? The general, emboldened by the king's momentary hesitation, pressed on. It is not just superstition, Your Majesty. Elisha has performed miracles. He has healed the sick, fed the hungry, even raised the dead. The Israelites believe he speaks with the voice of their God. And it seems, Your Majesty, that their God is listening. The room fell silent again, the weight of the words settling over the gathered men. The king's eyes narrowed, his hands clenching into fists. If what this general said was true, then this prophet wasn't just a nuisance, he was a threat. And threats had to be eliminated. Enough, the king said, his voice low and venomous. I don't care who this Elisha thinks he is or what his God can do. No man, no matter how powerful, can stand against the might of Aram. If he is the one interfering with my plans, then we will deal with him. Gather the armies. Every soldier, every horse, every chariot. Leave nothing behind. We march on Israel. The generals exchanged uneasy glances. Sending the entire army to capture one man? It seemed excessive, even reckless. But they knew better than to question the king. Orders were orders. And so, the preparations began. Soldiers were called from every corner of the kingdom. Weapons were polished, horses were saddled, and the drums of war began to beat. The king had set his sights on Elisha, and he would stop at nothing to see the prophet brought before him, alive or dead. Little did the king know, he was walking into a battle far beyond his understanding, a battle not of men and armies, but of faith and divine power. While the king's army mobilized, he sent ahead a single man, a spy, trained in the art of deception and assassination. This was no ordinary soldier. He was a shadow, a man who could blend into any crowd, slip into any city, and vanish without a trace. His mission was simple: find Elisha and eliminate him before he could warn the Israelites of the coming attack. The spy moved under the cover of darkness, his footsteps silent on the dusty roads. He had no need for maps or directions. Whispers in the marketplaces, hushed conversations in taverns, these were his guides. And soon, those whispers led him to a name, Dothan. A small, unassuming town nestled among the hills. That was where Elisha was said to be. The journey to Dothan was uneventful, the spy slipping through Israel's defenses unnoticed. By the time he reached the town, the sun had set, and the streets were quiet. The townsfolk, unaware of the danger lurking among them, had retired to their homes, their lamps casting faint glows through shuttered windows. The spy moved like a ghost, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. Finally, he found what he was looking for, a modest house on the edge of town, its single lamp flickering softly in the darkness. He approached the house cautiously, his hand resting on the hilt of his dagger. The night was still, the only sound the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. But as he reached the door, something changed. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. The spy hesitated, his instinct screaming at him to turn back. And then it happened. A light, a blinding, radiant light, burst forth from the house, flooding the street with an intensity that made the spy stagger back. It wasn't the warm glow of a lamp or the cold light of the moon. It was something else. Something alive. The spy shielded his eyes, but the light seemed to pierce through his hands, filling his vision with brilliance. He tried to move forward, but it was as if an invisible wall had risen before him, an impenetrable barrier that no mortal could cross. Panic set in. He turned to flee, but the light followed him, chasing him through the streets. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled over the uneven ground, his dagger forgotten in his desperation. By the time he reached the edge of town, he was trembling, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. What was that light? What had he just encountered? The spy returned to the king empty-handed, his confidence shattered. When he reported what had happened, his voice was barely a whisper. It wasn't natural, he said, his hands trembling. It wasn't human. It was something else. The king's fury only deepened. If stealth couldn't defeat this prophet, then he would unleash the full might of his army. One way or another, Elisha would fall. The Aramean army's march was relentless. From the horizon, the sheer scale of the advancing force was enough to strike fear into the bravest hearts. Rows upon rows of soldiers, their spears gleaming in the sunlight, their shields clanking in unison. The sound of marching boots created a deep, rhythmic thrum that seemed to reverberate through the ground itself. Villagers along the army's path had fled for their lives, leaving behind abandoned homes and smoldering fields. The trail of devastation was clear. This was an army on a mission, and nothing would stand in its way. As the soldiers drew closer to Dothan, the tension within the town reached a breaking point. People scrambled to gather their belongings, unsure of whether to run or stay and face their fate. Children cried as their parents whispered desperate prayers to the God of Israel. Doors were barricaded with furniture, windows were boarded up with whatever scraps of wood could be found. Yet no amount of preparation seemed enough to quell the growing fear. The townspeople knew the truth: they were no match for the might of Aram. The young servant of Elisha stood at the edge of the town, his heart pounding as he saw the dust cloud rising in the distance. The Aramean army was close, too close. He could hear the faint sound of drums, a war song that sent shivers down his spine. Panic surged through him as he turned and ran toward Elisha's modest home, his footsteps echoing in the empty streets. Bursting through the door, he gasped for breath, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "Master! They're here! The army of Aram! Hundreds of them! No, thousands! They're going to destroy us all!" Elisha looked up from his place of prayer, his expression calm, almost serene. There was no trace of fear in his eyes, no hint of the panic that had overtaken the town. The young servant stared at him in disbelief. "Master, did you hear me? The army is at our doorstep. They'll kill you first, and then they'll burn the town to the ground." But Elisha simply stood and placed a reassuring hand on the servant's trembling shoulder. His voice was steady, almost gentle, as he said, "Do not be afraid. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." The servant blinked, confused by the prophet's words. "What are you talking about? It's just us. There's no one else here. We're surrounded." His voice cracked with desperation as he gestured wildly toward the window. But Elisha only smiled, a calm, knowing smile that seemed out of place in the face of such danger. Turning toward the window, he raised his hands and began to pray. "Lord, open his eyes so that he may see." As Elisha finished his prayer, the servant felt a strange sensation, as though a veil had been lifted from his eyes. The world around him seemed to shift, to change, and suddenly, he saw it, something that made his knees buckle and his breath catch in his throat. The hills surrounding Dothan were no longer empty. They were filled with an army unlike anything he had ever imagined. Chariots of fire stood in formation, their wheels blazing with celestial flames. Warriors clad in shimmering armor, their swords glowing with a divine light, stood ready for battle. Their presence was overwhelming, their power undeniable. The servant fell to his knees, his hands shaking as he whispered, "Master, they're everywhere." Elisha stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the fiery army that surrounded the town. There was no fear in his eyes, only faith. He turned to his servant, his voice calm but firm. "Now you see," he said. "The Lord has sent his army. We are not alone. We have never been alone." Meanwhile, the Aramean army reached the outskirts of Dothan. The soldiers began to fan out, their commanders barking orders as they prepared to surround the town. From their perspective, it was an easy target, a small, defenseless settlement with no visible army to protect it. The king himself rode at the center of the formation, his face set in grim determination. He had come to capture a prophet, and he would not leave without him. But as the soldiers drew closer, an unease began to spread among their ranks. Horses whinnied nervously, their ears flicking back as though sensing something their riders could not. A strange stillness settled over the battlefield, broken only by the sound of the wind rustling through the grass. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, their hands tightening on their weapons. They could feel it, the weight of something unseen, something powerful. Back in the town, the people of Dothan peered cautiously from behind their barricaded windows, their hearts heavy with fear. They could see the enemy army now, a sea of men and weapons stretching as far as the eye could see. But they could not see what Elisha and his servant saw. They could not see the chariots of fire, the angelic warriors who stood guard over their town. To them, it seemed like the end was near. Elisha, however, remained unmoved. He stood at the edge of the town, his figure silhouetted against the rising sun. In the distance, the Aramean army closed in, their war cries growing louder with each passing moment. But Elisha's voice was steady, unshaken, as he began to pray once more. "Lord," he said, "strike this army with blindness." What happened next would be remembered as one of the most extraordinary displays of divine power in the history of Israel. The battle had begun, but it was a battle unlike any other. And it was a battle the Arameans were destined to lose. The sun had barely begun to rise over the hills of Dothan when the first signs of trouble appeared. It began as a distant murmur, a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. The people of the town were still asleep, unaware of the impending danger, but the young servant of Elisha had already risen. He stepped outside to draw water from the well, stretching as the cool morning air filled his lungs. But as he stood there, bucket in hand, he froze. The sound grew louder, more distinct. It was the sound of marching. His heart began to race as he squinted toward the horizon, his eyes adjusting to the dim light of dawn. And then he saw it, a shadow moving across the hills. No, not a shadow. A mass. A tide of soldiers, their armor glinting faintly in the early light. Horses snorted and pawed at the ground, their riders gripping spears and shields. The banners of Aram fluttered high above the advancing army, a grim reminder of the force that had crushed so many before them. The servant's breath caught in his throat. He blinked, hoping that the sight would disappear, that it was some trick of the light. But it wasn't. The army was real, and it was massive. He could see the glint of polished steel, hear the faint clatter of weapons, feel the weight of their presence even from a distance. His bucket slipped from his grasp, landing with a dull thud as water splashed across the dusty ground. Without a second thought, he turned and ran, his feet pounding against the dirt path as he made his way back to Elisha's house. Inside the town, the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the windows, casting long shadows across the streets. Farmers were just beginning to prepare for another day in the fields, merchants arranging their wares for the morning market. But the peace of the early morning was shattered when the servant burst through the door of Elisha's home, his face pale, his chest heaving. "Master," he cried, his voice trembling with panic. "You must wake up. They're here." Elisha, who had been kneeling in quiet prayer, looked up calmly. His expression was serene, unbothered by the commotion. "What's the matter?" he asked, his voice steady and reassuring. The servant struggled to catch his breath as he gestured wildly toward the window. "The army," he gasped. "The Arameans. They've surrounded us. There are so many of them. Hundreds. Thousands. We're trapped, Master. They're going to destroy us." His words tumbled out in a frantic rush, his eyes wide with fear. Elisha rose to his feet, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world. He walked to the window and looked out over the hills, his gaze sweeping across the scene before him. The sight of the enemy army might have been enough to break the spirit of any ordinary man. The soldiers stretched out as far as the eye could see, their ranks bristling with weapons, their faces grim with determination. But Elisha's expression didn't change. He showed no fear, no doubt. Instead, he turned back to his servant with a small, knowing smile. "Don't be afraid," he said gently, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. His voice was calm, almost soothing, as though he were comforting a child who had woken from a bad dream. "Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." The servant stared at him, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about, master?" he asked, his voice shaky. "It's just us. There's no one else here. Look out there. The hills are covered with soldiers. We're outnumbered. Outmatched. How can you say we have more than they do?" His panic grew with every word, his voice rising as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. But Elisha didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to the window, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The golden light of dawn was now spilling across the hills, illuminating the enemy army in all its terrible glory. Yet Elisha remained calm, his faith unshaken. The servant could hardly believe it. How could his master stand there so calmly in the face of such overwhelming odds? What did he see that the servant didn't? What did he know? Outside, the army of Aram continued to assemble, their movements precise and methodical. Commanders barked orders, their voices carrying across the still morning air. Soldiers tightened their grips on their weapons, their faces grim with determination. The town of Dothan was small, defenseless. To the Arameans, it was an easy target. And at its center was the prophet they had come to capture, the man who had so often thwarted their plans, who had become the focus of the king's wrath. This time, there would be no escape. Or so they thought. As the minutes ticked by, the people of Dothan began to stir. The first screams of alarm rang out as more townsfolk caught sight of the enemy army. Doors were slammed shut, windows were barred, and families huddled together in fear. The streets, which had moments ago been filled with the quiet bustle of morning activity, were now eerily silent, save for the distant sound of marching boots and clattering armor. The entire town seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash. Inside his home, Elisha remained a beacon of calm. His servant, however, was a different story. The young man paced back and forth, wringing his hands, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. "Master," he said again, his voice trembling. "What are we going to do? There's no way out. We're surrounded. They'll take you. They'll kill you. They'll destroy everything." But Elisha simply shook his head, his small smile never wavering. "Do not be afraid," he repeated. "Trust me. Everything will be fine." The servant wanted to believe him. He wanted to share in his master's unshakable faith. But as the sound of the approaching army grew louder, as the reality of the situation pressed down on him, he found it impossible to hold on to hope. In his mind, they were already defeated. Elisha stood at the window, his calm eyes fixed on the hills that surrounded the small town of Dothan. From his vantage point, he could see the enemy army clearly, the sea of soldiers, the banners of Aram fluttering in the wind, the glittering armor catching the morning sunlight. It was an overwhelming sight, one that would strike fear into even the bravest of hearts. But not Elisha. He stood motionless, his expression serene, as if the chaos outside was nothing more than a passing storm. Behind him, the young servant paced nervously, his anxiety growing with every moment. He couldn't understand how his master could remain so composed in the face of such overwhelming danger. "Master," he said, his voice trembling, "please, we have to do something. We can't just stand here. There's no way out. They've surrounded us on every side. They're going to take you, and they'll kill us all." His words came in a frantic rush, his panic spilling over as he wrung his hands and cast desperate glances toward the door, as if expecting the soldiers to burst in at any moment. Elisha turned to him, his gaze steady and reassuring. "Don't be afraid," he said softly, his voice carrying a calm authority that seemed to cut through the servant's panic. those who are with us are more than those who are with them." His words were simple, yet they carried a weight that the servant couldn't understand. The young man froze, staring at his master in disbelief. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "Master, there's no one here but us. It's just the two of us against an entire army." The servant's voice cracked with desperation as he gestured wildly toward the window. "Look outside. The hills are covered with soldiers. Their numbers are endless. And you're telling me not to be afraid? How can you say that? How can you believe that we're not alone when there's no one here but us?" His words hung in the air, heavy with fear and disbelief. He couldn't see what Elisha saw. He couldn't feel the quiet confidence that radiated from the prophet like a steady flame. Elisha smiled, a small, knowing smile that seemed almost out of place in such a dire situation. He reached out and placed a hand on the servant's shoulder, his touch firm but comforting. "Come," he said, guiding the young man to the window. "Let me show you something." Together, they stood at the edge of the room, their eyes fixed on the horizon where the enemy army loomed like a dark storm. Elisha closed his eyes and lifted his hands, his voice steady as he began to pray. "Lord," he said, his tone filled with quiet reverence, "open his eyes so that he may see." The servant felt a strange sensation as the words left Elisha's lips, as though the air around him had shifted. It was subtle at first, a faint tingling that spread from his chest to his fingertips. And then, in an instant, the world around him changed. The hills that had been filled with enemy soldiers just moments ago were now alive with a different kind of army, an army of fire. He gasped, his eyes widening as he took in the sight before him. Chariots of fire blazed across the landscape, their wheels glowing with an unearthly light. Angelic warriors stood in perfect formation, their armor shimmering like molten gold, their swords blazing with divine flames. The air was thick with their presence, a power so overwhelming that it made the servant's knees buckle. He clutched the windowsill for support, his heart racing as he whispered, "Master, what is this? Who are they?" Elisha's smile widened, his eyes shining with faith. "They are the armies of the Lord," he said simply. "They have been here all along, watching over us, protecting us. You see, my young friend, we are never alone. Not when God is with us." His words carried a quiet confidence that seemed to fill the room, dispelling the fear that had gripped the servant just moments ago. The young man stared at the fiery chariots, his fear slowly melting away as awe and wonder took its place. For the first time, he understood what Elisha had been trying to tell him. The enemy army, as vast and powerful as it seemed, was nothing compared to the forces that surrounded them. He could see it now, the divine protection that had been with them all along, unseen but unwavering. He turned to Elisha, his voice trembling with newfound faith. "Master, I'm sorry. I didn't understand before. But now I see." Elisha nodded, his expression calm and resolute. "Faith, my friend," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "It is the key to seeing what cannot be seen, to trusting in what cannot be touched. Remember this moment, for it is a reminder that God's power is greater than anything the world can throw at us." The servant nodded, his fear replaced by a quiet determination. He stood taller now, his gaze steady as he looked out at the hills, no longer afraid of what lay ahead. Outside, the Aramean army continued to prepare for their assault, their movements precise and methodical. But they couldn't see what the servant now saw. They couldn't feel the presence of the divine army that stood ready to defend Elisha and the town of Dothan. The enemy soldiers believed they had already won, that their numbers and strength would guarantee their victory. They had no idea that they were about to face a power far beyond their comprehension. Inside the house, Elisha turned back to his prayers, his faith unshaken, his trust in God absolute. The battle was coming, but it was not a battle that would be won with swords or spears. It was a battle of faith, and Elisha knew without a shadow of a doubt who would emerge victorious. As the young servant stood by the window, his newfound sense of awe and wonder at the fiery angelic army began to settle. The blazing chariots of fire and the angelic warriors filled him with a courage he had never known. For the first time, the overwhelming fear that had gripped him earlier seemed distant, as if it had been nothing more than a shadow easily dispelled by light. But just as hope began to take root in his heart, the atmosphere shifted. It began as a faint whisper, a distant rustling carried by the morning breeze. The servant furrowed his brow, leaning forward to listen. The sound was barely audible at first, blending with the natural hum of the world waking up. But it grew louder, more distinct. It was no longer the gentle whisper of wind but a low, ominous rumble. The sound of something massive, something unstoppable, moving closer with every passing moment. Elisha remained at his place of prayer, unshaken by the growing noise. But the servant's sense of unease began to rise once more. He peered out the window, his gaze scanning the horizon. What he saw made his heart sink all over again. A dark cloud was forming in the distance, swirling and shifting as it climbed higher and higher into the sky. At first, he thought it was smoke, perhaps the Arameans were burning something. But as the cloud grew larger, its swirling patterns more violent, the servant realized this was no ordinary cloud. "Master," he called out, his voice tinged with worry. "There's something out there. It's coming this way." Elisha didn't look up. "What do you see?" he asked, his tone calm and steady. The servant's hands gripped the edge of the window frame as he tried to make sense of the sight before him. It's a storm, Master. A great storm. I've never seen anything like it before." The dark cloud continued to grow, rolling across the hills with an unnatural speed. It wasn't just a single storm cloud, it was a mass of swirling dust and wind, a tempest that seemed alive. The Aramean army, still stationed on the hills around Dothan, was now partially obscured by the advancing storm. Horses neighed and stamped their hooves, their riders struggling to maintain control. The clatter of armor and the shouts of commanders echoed faintly through the thickening air. Inside the house, the servant's sense of panic began to rise again. The fiery army of angels was still there, glowing brightly on the hills, but the storm seemed to swallow everything else. "Master, is this a sign?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Is it a sign of destruction? Is this the end? Are we being punished for something?" He turned to Elisha, his wide eyes pleading for an answer. But Elisha didn't flinch. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate, and walked to stand beside the servant. "This is no punishment," Elisha said, his voice steady, a quiet confidence radiating from him. "What you see is a reminder. A reminder of who holds the power over the heavens and the earth. This storm is not here to destroy us, it is here to reveal the might of our God." His words carried a weight that seemed to settle the servant's trembling hands, though the storm outside continued to grow more violent. The wind began to howl, whistling through the narrow streets of Dothan. Dust and debris swirled through the air, stinging the eyes of anyone who ventured outside. The people of the town had barricaded themselves in their homes, praying fervently as the storm raged around them. Windows rattled, doors creaked under the pressure of the wind, and the distant sound of the Aramean army's chaos reached their ears. Horses reared and neighed in panic, their riders struggling to steady them as the storm's fury grew. The servant watched in stunned silence as the Aramean soldiers began to scatter. The storm had reached their ranks, and the once mighty army was now in disarray. Commanders shouted orders, but their voices were lost in the roar of the wind. Soldiers stumbled as the ground beneath them became slick with loose dirt, their formations breaking apart under the relentless onslaught of dust and debris. What had once been a symbol of overwhelming power now seemed fragile, small, and powerless in the face of the storm. But the storm wasn't just a natural occurrence, it was something more. It was precise, calculated. As the servant watched, he realized that the fiery angelic army remained untouched, standing firm on the hills despite the raging winds. The storm seemed to move around them, as if guided by an unseen hand. Its full force was reserved for the Arameans, enveloping their ranks in a swirling vortex of chaos. "Master, how is this possible?" the servant asked, his voice barely audible over the noise. Elisha turned to him, his expression calm and resolute. "This storm is not of this world," he said simply. "It is a demonstration of God's power, a reminder to those who stand against him that their strength is nothing compared to his. Watch closely, for the Lord is about to deliver us." The servant's fear began to ebb, replaced by a growing sense of awe. He turned his gaze back to the battlefield, his heart pounding as he realized the truth of Elisha's words. The storm was more than just a natural phenomenon, it was a message, a warning, and a shield all at once. The Arameans, so confident in their numbers and their might, were now at the mercy of a force they could neither fight nor understand. As the storm raged on, the young servant felt something shift within him. The fear that had consumed him earlier seemed distant now, replaced by a quiet, unshakable faith. He turned to Elisha, his voice steady for the first time. "Master, I understand now. God's power is greater than anything we face. We have nothing to fear." Elisha smiled, his eyes filled with pride and reassurance. "Exactly," he said. "Faith is our greatest weapon. And with it, we are never alone." Outside, the storm began to reach its peak, the dust and wind swirling into a towering vortex that seemed to stretch into the heavens. The Aramean army was in complete disarray, their once formidable strength reduced to chaos. And amidst it all, the people of Dothan prayed, their voices rising above the noise as they placed their trust in the God who had sent the storm to protect them. Elisha stood in the center of the room, his posture calm and composed despite the storm of emotions swirling around him. The young servant, still trembling from the sight of the massive Aramean army, watched his master with a mixture of desperation and confusion. The world outside was on the brink of chaos, yet here stood Elisha, as steady as a mountain. It was as if he was untouched by fear, as if he knew something that no one else could see. "Master," the servant said, his voice quivering. "What are we going to do? They're coming for us. There's no way out. The army is too large, too strong. We're completely surrounded." His words were a torrent of panic, spilling out uncontrollably. He paced back and forth, his eyes darting toward the door as if expecting soldiers to burst through at any moment. But Elisha remained unmoved. With a gentle smile, the prophet turned to his servant and placed a hand on his shoulder. His touch was firm but comforting, grounding the young man in the midst of his turmoil. "Do not be afraid," Elisha said, his voice steady and reassuring. "Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." The servant froze, staring at his master in disbelief. How could Elisha say such a thing? How could he believe that they had any advantage when the enemy army was right outside, ready to strike? Elisha could see the doubt in the young man's eyes, the fear that clouded his thoughts and prevented him from understanding the truth. But Elisha knew that faith was not something that could be forced, it had to be seen, felt, experienced. And so, with a calm resolve, he turned his face toward heaven and began to pray. "Lord," he said, his voice filled with quiet authority, "open his eyes so that he may see." The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that seemed to fill the room. The servant stood still, his breath caught in his throat as he watched his master, the man who seemed to hold an unshakable connection to something far greater than himself. The air in the room seemed to shift, becoming heavy with an unseen presence. The servant's heart pounded as he waited, unsure of what would happen next. As Elisha lowered his hands, a profound stillness settled over the room. The servant blinked, his vision blurring for a moment. And then, everything changed. It was as though a veil had been lifted from his eyes, as though he was seeing the world not with his physical sight, but with his soul. The hills outside the window, which had moments ago been filled with the menacing presence of the Aramean army, were now alive with something far more powerful. The servant's breath caught in his throat as his eyes widened in awe. What he saw was beyond anything he could have imagined, beyond anything he had ever thought possible. The hills were no longer just hills, they were alive with light and fire, with a presence so overwhelming that it made his knees buckle. Surrounding Elisha, the town, and the hills beyond was a vast army, but it was not an army of men. It was an army of angels. They stood tall and radiant, their forms shimmering with an otherworldly brilliance. Each one was clad in armor that seemed to glow like molten gold, their swords blazing with a fire that burned brighter than the sun. Their chariots were not made of wood or metal but of flames, wheels turning with an intensity that seemed to consume the very air around them. The light they radiated was blinding, yet it did not hurt to look upon them. Instead, it filled the servant with a sense of awe and wonder, a feeling that he was standing in the presence of something holy. The servant's legs gave way beneath him, and he sank to the floor, his hands clutching the windowsill for support. His voice trembled as he whispered, "Master, what is this? Who are they?" He could hardly find the words to describe what he was seeing. It was unlike anything he had ever known, a reality that defied explanation. Elisha knelt beside him, his expression calm and full of faith. "They are the armies of the Lord," he said simply. "They have been here all along, watching over us, protecting us. You could not see them before because your eyes were focused on the things of this world. But now, the Lord has opened your eyes to see the truth, that we are never alone. His power is greater than anything that stands against us." The servant stared at the angelic warriors, his fear slowly melting away as a sense of peace and security filled his heart. He realized now that the Aramean army, as vast and terrifying as it seemed, was nothing compared to the power of the divine forces that surrounded them. The enemy soldiers were like ants before a mighty storm, their strength insignificant in the face of such overwhelming glory. But as the servant continued to watch, he noticed something curious. The angelic army, though vast and powerful, remained still. They did not charge forward to attack the Arameans. Their blazing swords and fiery chariots were poised, ready for battle, yet they did not move. It was as if they were waiting, for what, the servant did not know. He turned to Elisha, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Master," he said, "why don't they act? Why don't they strike down the enemy?" Elisha's smile deepened, his eyes shining with an unshakable faith. "They are waiting," he said, his voice calm and assured. "They do nothing without the command of the Lord. He alone decides when and how they will act. Their strength is not in their weapons but in their obedience to His will." The servant nodded slowly, his heart swelling with a newfound understanding. This was not just a battle of flesh and blood, it was a battle of faith, a test of trust in the divine. The angelic army was a reminder of God's power, but it was also a call to believe, to place their lives in His hands and trust that His timing was perfect. The young man looked out at the hills once more, his fear completely gone. The sight of the Aramean army no longer filled him with dread. Instead, he saw them as they truly were, mere men, limited and finite, standing against the infinite power of the Creator. He turned to Elisha, his voice steady and filled with determination. "Master, I understand now. We have nothing to fear. God is with us, and His will is greater than anything the enemy can do." Elisha nodded, his expression one of quiet pride. "Exactly," he said. "Faith is the key. And with faith, we are never truly alone." Together, they stood at the window, watching as the angelic army continued to stand guard, their fiery presence a testament to the power and glory of God. The battle was far from over, but the servant knew now that the outcome was already decided. The Lord was with them, and that was all they needed. The storm had begun to settle, the dust hanging low over the hills like a thick veil. But as the winds died down, the Aramean army began to regroup. Their commanders barked orders, their voices cutting through the stillness as soldiers hurried to reform their ranks. Despite the chaos caused by the storm, the Arameans' resolve remained unbroken. They were here for one purpose: to capture Elisha. And they would not leave without him. From their vantage point in Dothan, Elisha and his servant watched as the enemy prepared to advance. The servant's newfound faith had quelled much of his fear, but the sight of the massive army still sent a chill down his spine. "Master," he said quietly, his voice steady but uncertain. "What will happen now?" "They're coming for us." Elisha turned to him, his expression calm and unshaken. "Do not worry," he said simply. "The Lord has not abandoned us. Watch and see what he will do." His words carried a quiet confidence that silenced the servant's doubts. Together, they stood at the window, waiting as the enemy army began to move toward the town. The Arameans marched with precision, their spears raised, their shields gleaming in the morning light. Their boots pounded against the earth in unison, a sound that seemed to echo through the very streets of Dothan. The townspeople huddled inside their homes, their prayers rising like a desperate chorus as the enemy drew closer. The tension in the air was palpable, every second stretching into an eternity. Then, as the first wave of soldiers reached the outskirts of the town, Elisha stepped forward. He raised his hands toward heaven, his voice calm but firm as he began to pray. "Lord," he said, "strike this army with blindness." The words hung in the air, heavy with authority, as though the very heavens had been called to attention. For a moment, nothing happened. The soldiers continued their advance, their expressions fierce and determined. But then, one by one, they began to falter. The lead soldier stumbled, his spear slipping from his grasp as he clutched at his eyes. Another dropped his shield, his face twisting in confusion. Within moments, the entire front line was in disarray, soldiers crying out as they groped blindly at the air. Panic spread through the ranks like wildfire. "I can't see," one shouted, his voice trembling with fear. "What's happening? I can't see anything." The commanders tried to restore order, shouting commands and waving their arms, but it was no use. The blindness had spread through the entire army, leaving them helpless and disoriented. Soldiers collided with one another, their weapons clattering to the ground as they stumbled in confusion. The once mighty force that had marched with such confidence was now reduced to chaos. Elisha watched the scene unfold with a quiet satisfaction. He turned to his servant, a small smile playing on his lips. "Come," he said. "We have work to do." Without hesitation, Elisha stepped out of the house and walked toward the army. The servant followed closely, his heart pounding as he realized what his master intended to do. "This is not the road you want," Elisha called out, his voice cutting through the noise of the panicked soldiers. "And this is not the city you are looking for. Follow me, and I will lead you to the man you seek." The soldiers, blind and desperate for guidance, began to gather around Elisha. They had no choice but to trust him, their only hope in the darkness that now consumed them. One by one, they fell into line, their weapons forgotten as they followed the prophet out of Dothan and into the open countryside. The journey to Samaria was one of silence and awe. The once mighty Aramean army, now rendered helpless, followed Elisha like lost sheep. The soldiers stumbled along the narrow paths, their hands outstretched in search of guidance, their eyes clouded by the divine blindness that had overtaken them. It was a sight both strange and profound, an entire army, defeated not by sword or spear, but by the power of prayer and faith. The servant, walking close behind Elisha, could barely believe what he was witnessing. "Master," the servant whispered, his voice low with wonder, "what will we do with them once we reach Samaria? Surely the king will demand vengeance for all they've done." Elisha did not answer immediately. His steps were steady, his gaze fixed ahead, as though he saw something beyond the horizon that no one else could. "Trust in the Lord," he said at last, his voice calm but resolute. "He will guide us." The servant nodded, though his heart still carried the weight of uncertainty. As they approached the gates of Samaria, the news of their arrival had already reached the city. The watchmen on the walls stared in disbelief as the Aramean army, known for their ruthlessness and strength, stumbled blindly toward the gates. Whispers spread like wildfire among the Israelite soldiers stationed there. "What's happening?" one asked, his voice tinged with both confusion and awe. "Are they surrendering?" another murmured. "Look at them, they can't even see." The gates creaked open slowly, and Elisha led the blind soldiers into the heart of the city. The streets were lined with onlookers, their faces a mixture of astonishment and apprehension. Mothers clutched their children tightly, while merchants abandoned their stalls to catch a glimpse of the strange procession. The air was thick with tension, every step of the enemy army echoing loudly in the hushed silence. The Israelites followed closely, their weapons drawn, ready to strike at the first sign of danger. Inside the royal palace, the king of Israel waited with growing impatience. When the news reached him that Elisha had brought the entire Aramean army into the city, his mind raced with possibilities. Could this be the end of their enemies? Would this be the moment when Israel would finally triumph over their oppressors? The king rose from his throne and hurried to meet Elisha, his excitement barely contained. When the king arrived, his eyes widened at the sight before him. The enemy soldiers were huddled together in the courtyard, their once proud demeanor replaced by confusion and vulnerability. Elisha stood calmly in their midst, his presence commanding but compassionate. The king approached him quickly, his voice eager and tinged with anticipation. "My father," he said, addressing the prophet with respect, "what should we do with them? Shall I strike them down? Shall I kill them all?" There was an urgency in his tone, a hunger for vengeance that mirrored the pain and fear his people had endured for so long. Elisha turned to face the king, his expression stern but patient. "No," he said firmly, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the murmurs of the gathered crowd. "Would you kill men you have captured with your own sword or bow? These men are prisoners, not enemies. They are helpless, and they have been delivered into our hands by the Lord. It is not for us to take their lives." The king hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the prophet's words. Mercy was not what he had expected, nor what he had wanted. But there was a wisdom in Elisha's gaze that he could not deny. Elisha stepped closer, his voice softening as he continued. "Instead of killing them, treat them with kindness. Feed them. Give them water. Show them that Israel is not like Aram, that we are a people who honor the Lord in all things. Let them see his mercy through us." The king frowned, his brow furrowed in thought. It was a radical idea, one that went against every instinct he had as a leader in a time of war. But he knew better than to question the prophet's guidance. With a reluctant nod, he turned to his advisors. "Prepare a feast," he commanded. "Let us do as the prophet says." What followed was a scene that no one in Samaria would ever forget. Tables were brought into the courtyard and laden with food and drink. The Aramean soldiers, still blind and disoriented, were seated at the tables and served by their captors. There was no malice in the gestures of the Israelites, no mockery in their actions, only kindness, as if they were hosting honored guests rather than enemy soldiers. The soldiers ate in silence, their confusion slowly giving way to gratitude as they realized the mercy that had been shown to them. When the meal was over, Elisha prayed once more, and the soldiers' sight was restored. They blinked in disbelief, their eyes adjusting to the light as they looked around at the faces of the Israelites who had fed them. It was a moment of profound realization for many of them. They had come to destroy, yet they had been shown mercy. They had prepared for bloodshed, yet they had been given bread and water. For a brief moment, the tension between the two nations seemed to dissolve, replaced by an unspoken understanding. Elisha stepped forward and addressed the soldiers, his voice carrying a tone of quiet authority. "You have seen the power of the Lord today," he said. "Go back to your master and tell him what has happened here. Let him know that Israel does not seek war but peace. Go now, and do not return with violence in your hearts." The soldiers, humbled and silent, rose from their seats and began the journey back to Aram. The gates of Samaria closed behind them, and the Israelites erupted into celebration. For days, the streets of Samaria were filled with joy. The people praised Elisha for his wisdom and thanked the Lord for his miraculous intervention. The king himself marveled at the events that had unfolded, his respect for the prophet growing deeper with each passing moment. It seemed as though peace had finally been achieved, that the threat of Aram had been neutralized without a single drop of blood being spilled. But beneath the surface, a new danger was quietly taking shape, one that would soon test Israel's faith and resolve once more. Among the soldiers of Aram who returned to their homeland, one man stood apart from the rest. He was no ordinary soldier, but a high-ranking commander, cunning, ruthless, and calculating. While the other soldiers stumbled home in a haze of disbelief and shame, their minds preoccupied with the mercy they had been shown, this man's thoughts moved in a different direction. His sharp mind had been working tirelessly throughout the entire ordeal. Feigning blindness, he had carefully observed everything: the layout of Samaria's streets, the positioning of its gates, the thickness of its walls, and the vulnerabilities of its defenses. What Israel had intended as an act of mercy, he saw as an opportunity, a golden chance to strike back. As the soldiers entered the royal court, bowing before their king, the air was thick with humiliation and anger. The king of Aram listened in silence as his men recounted the events that had unfolded: the blinding light, the march to Samaria, the strange feast, and finally, the mercy that had spared their lives. Each word was like salt in a wound, deepening his humiliation. His army, the pride of Aram, had been led like helpless lambs into the heart of their enemy's capital. And now, they stood before him, defeated without a single arrow being loosed. The king's face darkened with every word, his hands clenching into fists as he fought to contain his fury. Finally, the commander stepped forward, bowing low before the throne. His expression was calm, his voice smooth and confident as he addressed the king. "Your Majesty," he began, his tone measured but deliberate. "Though today's events may seem like a humiliation, they have given us something far more valuable than mere victory. I have seen Samaria with my own eyes. I have walked its streets, observed its defenses, and studied its layout. Your Majesty, their walls are weaker than they appear. Their gates, though imposing, are vulnerable. Their soldiers are ill-prepared for a full-scale attack. And their trust in their God, it blinds them to the realities of war." The other soldiers murmured in agreement, their spirits lifting slightly at the commander's bold words. The king leaned forward on his throne, his eyes narrowing as he listened. "Go on," he said, his voice low and dangerous. The commander continued, his confidence growing with every word. "With a larger force, Your Majesty, we could crush them entirely. They spared us today, but their mercy is their weakness. Let us use this opportunity to strike while they are unprepared. Let us show them the true might of Aram." The room fell silent as the king considered the commander's proposal. His anger, still simmering beneath the surface, now found a direction, a purpose. He nodded slowly, his lips curling into a grim smile. "Very well," he said at last, his voice cold and resolute. "We will gather our forces. And this time, there will be no mercy." The commander bowed again, a glint of triumph in his eyes. He had planted the seed of vengeance, and now, it would grow into a storm that would descend upon Israel with a fury unmatched. But beneath the commander's calculated words and the king's simmering rage lay a deeper truth, one that neither of them could comprehend. The mercy that Israel had shown was not weakness, it was strength. And though the Arameans saw an opportunity to exploit, they were walking into a divine plan far greater than their own. For in their ambition, they had forgotten one crucial fact: Israel was not defended by walls or gates, but by the Lord of hosts. And the battle that was coming would not be fought on their terms, but his. As the Aramean court buzzed with preparations for the next assault, the commander quietly slipped away, his mind already working on the details of the attack. He retraced every step he had taken in Samaria, every observation he had made. He could see it clearly in his mind, the points of weakness, the paths to victory. He would lead the assault himself, and this time, there would be no feast, no mercy, no retreat. Samaria would fall, and Israel's faith in their God would crumble beneath the weight of Aram's power. Or so he thought. As the days turned into weeks, the people of Samaria began to settle back into their routines. The fear and tension that had gripped the city during the Aramean invasion seemed like a distant memory. Markets bustled with activity, children played in the streets, and the air was filled with a sense of cautious hope. But beneath the surface, a dark undercurrent was stirring, one that threatened to unravel the fragile peace that had been restored. In a shadowy corner of the city, a group of men gathered in secret. Their faces were obscured by the flickering light of a single oil lamp, their voices low and conspiratorial. These were men of Israel, but their loyalty to their nation and their God had been corrupted by greed and ambition. They had been approached by emissaries from Aram, who promised them wealth and power in exchange for one simple act: betrayal. "The gates of Samaria are strong," one of the men murmured, his voice barely audible. "But even the strongest gates can be opened from within." His companions nodded in agreement, their expressions grim. They had seen the might of the Aramean army firsthand, and they knew that Israel could not withstand another full-scale assault. "If we align ourselves with Aram," another man added, "we'll be on the winning side. When they take the city, they'll reward us for our loyalty." Their words dripped with self-interest, their thoughts consumed by personal gain rather than the well-being of their people. But not all were so easily swayed. Among the conspirators was a young man named Micah, whose heart was heavy with doubt. He had joined the group out of desperation, lured by promises of wealth to provide for his struggling family. But as he listened to their plans, a deep unease began to grow within him. He thought of Elisha, the prophet who had saved them from the Aramean army. He thought of the mercy that had been shown to their enemies, the divine power that had protected their city. And he wondered, could he truly betray his people, knowing what he did about the God who watched over them? That night, as the conspirators finalized their plans, Micah slipped away. The weight of his decision bore down on him as he made his way through the darkened streets of Samaria. His steps were hesitant, his mind racing with fear and uncertainty. Finally, he arrived at Elisha's home. The prophet was kneeling in prayer, his face illuminated by the soft glow of a lamp. He looked up as Micah entered, his gaze steady and knowing. "What troubles you, my son?" Elisha asked, his voice calm and gentle. Micah hesitated, his words caught in his throat. But as he looked into the prophet's eyes, he felt a surge of courage. "There are men," he said, his voice trembling. "Men who plan to betray the city. They're going to open the gates for the Arameans." Elisha listened in silence, his expression grave but composed. When Micah finished speaking, the prophet rose to his feet. "You have done the right thing by coming to me," he said. "The Lord sees all things, and he will not let this betrayal go unanswered. Stay here, and do not fear. God's hand is upon this city, and he will deliver us once more." As the night deepened, the conspirators made their move. Under the cover of darkness, they crept to the gates of Samaria, their hearts pounding with anticipation. The Aramean army, larger and more fearsome than before, waited just beyond the city walls, their weapons glinting in the moonlight. With trembling hands, the traitors began to unbolt the gates, their breaths quick and shallow. They could feel the weight of their actions, but the promise of power and wealth spurred them on. And then, just as the gates began to creak open, everything changed. The night was still, the air heavy with anticipation. The conspirators crouched by the gates, their breaths shallow and quick. Beyond the walls, the Aramean army stood poised for the signal, their ranks bristling with weapons and their eyes gleaming with the hunger for conquest. The faint moonlight illuminated the scene, casting long shadows that danced across the stone walls of Samaria. It seemed as though nothing could stop what was about to happen. With trembling hands, one of the conspirators slid the final bolt from the gate. The creaking sound of the heavy wooden door echoed through the silence, and for a moment, time itself seemed to pause. Then, the gate swung open, revealing the waiting army. The Aramean soldiers surged forward, their footsteps a thunderous roar as they charged into the city. Victory seemed assured, their strength overwhelming and their confidence unshaken. But just as the first wave of soldiers crossed the threshold, a strange and terrible phenomenon swept through their ranks. It began as a faint hum, a low vibration that seemed to rise from the ground itself. The soldiers hesitated, their steps faltering as they exchanged uneasy glances. Then, without warning, the hum erupted into a deafening roar, and the air was filled with an intense heat. Cries of pain rang out as the soldiers dropped their weapons, clutching their hands in agony. Spears clattered to the ground, their wooden shafts blackened as though scorched by an invisible flame. Swords, once gleaming with deadly precision, glowed red-hot, their hilts too searing to hold. Shields were abandoned as their metal surfaces burned with an intensity that defied explanation. The chaos spread rapidly through the Aramean ranks. Commanders shouted orders, their voices desperate and strained, but the soldiers were beyond control. Some tore off their armor, their faces twisted in pain as the metal burned against their skin. Others stumbled backward, their eyes wide with terror as they tried to make sense of what was happening. The mighty Aramean army, which had marched with such confidence and strength, was now a mass of confusion and panic. At the same time, a brilliant light burst forth from the heavens, piercing the darkness with an otherworldly radiance. It was not the soft glow of the moon or the warm flicker of firelight. This was something far greater, far more powerful. The conspirators, still standing by the gates, shielded their eyes from the blinding brilliance. It filled the entire city, spilling over the walls and illuminating the surrounding hills. It was as if the very presence of God had descended upon Samaria. The source of the light soon became clear. The angelic army, which had once stood guard over Dothan, now appeared in full force. Their fiery chariots blazed with an intensity that seemed to consume the very air around them, their wheels turning with a divine energy. The angelic warriors stood tall, their forms shimmering with an unearthly brilliance. Their swords burned with celestial flames, their armor gleaming like molten gold. The sight was overwhelming, a display of power so pure and absolute that it brought the entire city to a standstill. The Aramean soldiers, seeing the angelic warriors descending upon them, were seized with a terror unlike anything they had ever known. Their battle cries turned to screams of fear as they abandoned their positions, their weapons, and their pride. Some fled blindly into the night, their footsteps echoing through the empty streets. Others dropped to their knees, their faces buried in their hands as they begged for mercy. The light followed them, casting long, flickering shadows as they disappeared into the wilderness, their once formidable army reduced to chaos. Inside the city, the people of Samaria watched in awe, their fear giving way to a profound sense of wonder. Mothers held their children close, their eyes wide with disbelief as they beheld the divine spectacle. The elders murmured prayers of gratitude, their voices trembling with emotion. The once bustling streets fell silent, save for the sound of the fleeing enemy and the radiant hum of the angelic presence. At the center of it all stood Elisha, his hands raised in prayer, his face radiant with the light of the Lord's glory. His servant stood beside him, his heart filled with awe as he witnessed the miraculous intervention. "The Lord has delivered us once again," Elisha said, his voice steady and filled with gratitude. "His power is unmatched, and his protection is unfailing. Let this be a lesson to all who doubt. The God of Israel is a shield to his people and a sword against their enemies." As the last of the Aramean soldiers disappeared into the wilderness, the light began to fade. The fiery chariots and angelic warriors slowly vanished, their task complete. The city of Samaria, once on the brink of destruction, now stood unharmed, a testament to the power and mercy of the Almighty. The people of Israel gathered in the streets, their voices rising in a chorus of praise and thanksgiving. They knew that they had witnessed something extraordinary, something that would be remembered for generations to come. But even as the city rejoiced, Elisha's expression remained thoughtful. He turned to his servant, his voice quiet but firm. "The Lord has delivered us today," he said, "but we must remain vigilant. The enemy may have been driven away, but the true battle is not over. We must guard not only our city but also our hearts, for the greatest threats often come from within." His words carried a weight that lingered in the air, a reminder that the victory they had witnessed was not just a triumph of strength, but a call to faith and vigilance. As dawn broke over the city of Samaria, a heavy silence hung over the streets. The conspirators, men who had betrayed their own people, were marched into the central courtyard under heavy guard. Their hands were bound with rough cords, their faces pale and drawn as they shuffled forward. A crowd had gathered to witness their fate. Mothers held their children close, elders leaned on their staffs, and soldiers stood at attention, their faces grim with quiet anger. Whispers rippled through the crowd, growing louder with each passing moment. "Is it true?" One voice called out. "Did they really betray us?" Another voice answered, trembling with indignation. "They opened the gates to the Arameans. They would have handed us over if not for the Lord's intervention." The murmurs turned to shouts, and soon the air was filled with anger and disbelief. The people of Samaria, who had survived the Aramean invasion by the grace of God, now faced the bitter truth: their greatest danger had not come from the enemy outside, but from the traitors within. At the center of the courtyard stood Elisha, his presence commanding yet calm. He watched the conspirators closely, his gaze steady and piercing. These men, who had sought to profit from their treachery, now stood exposed and powerless. One of the elders stepped forward, his voice firm as he addressed the crowd. "These men," he declared, gesturing toward the prisoners, "sought to betray their own people. They conspired with our enemies, opening the gates of our city to those who would have destroyed us. For their greed and ambition, they put every man, woman, and child in Samaria at risk." The crowd erupted in anger, their voices rising in a chorus of condemnation. Some demanded swift punishment, their words laced with fury. "Death to the traitors!" One man shouted, shaking his fist in the air. Others called for justice, their tones heavy with disappointment and sorrow. "How could they do this?" a woman cried, clutching her child tightly. "After everything we've been through, how could they betray us?" Elisha raised his hand, and the noise of the crowd gradually subsided. His voice, calm but resolute, carried across the courtyard. "My brothers and sisters," he began, "listen to me. These men sought to undermine the protection of the Lord, but their plans have failed. It was not by our strength or wisdom that the city was saved, but by the hand of God. Let this be a lesson to us all: Israel is not defended by walls or gates, but by the faith of its people and the power of the Almighty." His words carried a weight that seemed to settle over the crowd, quieting their anger and filling them with a sense of solemn reflection. Elisha turned to the conspirators, his gaze unwavering. "As for you," he said, his voice stern but not unkind, "you have betrayed your people, your nation, and your God. You sought to divide us, to bring destruction upon those who trusted you. Your actions cannot be excused, and your punishment must serve as a warning to others." The conspirators lowered their heads, unable to meet his eyes. They knew that there was no defense for what they had done. The elders of the city conferred briefly before announcing the sentence. "You will be exiled from Israel," one of them declared. "Your names will be erased from our records, and you will carry the mark of your betrayal for the rest of your days. Let all who see you know what becomes of those who turn against their own people." The conspirators were led away, their faces pale with shame and regret. As they passed through the crowd, the people parted to let them through, their eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sorrow. No one raised a hand against them, but the weight of their disgrace was punishment enough. As the crowd began to disperse, Elisha remained in the courtyard, his expression thoughtful. One of the elders approached him, his voice low. "Do you think this will be enough to prevent future betrayals?" he asked. Elisha turned to him, his gaze steady. "It is not enough to punish betrayal," he said. "We must also guard our hearts and our faith. The enemy does not only attack with swords and spears. They seek to sow division, to turn us against one another. But as long as we remain united in faith, no weapon formed against us shall prosper." The elder nodded, his face thoughtful as he considered the prophet's words. The people of Samaria had been spared, but the events of the night had revealed a deeper truth: the greatest threats often came not from without, but from within. And while the city's walls and gates could be repaired, the bonds of trust and faith among its people would require vigilance and devotion to rebuild. That night, as the stars glittered above the city, the people of Samaria knelt in prayer. They thanked the Lord for his protection and asked for his guidance in the days to come. And as they prayed, a sense of peace settled over the city, a peace born not of complacency, but of a renewed commitment to stand together, united in faith and purpose. The victory over the Aramean army had filled the streets of Samaria with celebration. Families rejoiced in their homes, merchants returned to their shops, and the air was alive with the sound of thanksgiving prayers to the Lord. But as the day gave way to evening, the mood began to shift. A stillness fell over the city, a quiet so profound that it felt unnatural. The air grew heavy, and a strange tension seemed to hang over the people like an unspoken warning. Then, just as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the hills, the earth beneath Samaria began to tremble. At first, it was a faint vibration, subtle enough that many dismissed it as nothing more than a passing disturbance. But within moments, the trembling intensified. The vibrations rippled through the ground, shaking the cobblestone streets and causing wooden beams to creak and groan under the strain. Cups rattled on tables, and windows shuddered in their frames. The people paused in their celebrations, their laughter fading into murmurs of confusion and unease. "What was that?" a merchant whispered, clutching the edge of his stall as the ground beneath him seemed to shift again. Nearby, a group of children stopped their play, their wide eyes darting nervously toward the adults for reassurance. But no one had answers. The trembling continued, growing stronger with each passing second. Stones cracked and crumbled, and the once firm foundation of the city felt as though it was coming apart. Panic began to spread like wildfire. People rushed out of their homes, their faces pale with fear as they clung to their loved ones. Mothers held their children tightly, whispering hurried prayers, while fathers stood protectively in front of their families, their eyes scanning the horizon for some explanation. "Is it another attack?" someone shouted, their voice tinged with desperation. "Is it the Arameans again?" another cried. But the enemy had already fled, and the true source of the trembling remained unseen. As the quaking grew more violent, the streets of Samaria erupted into chaos. Walls groaned under the strain, cracks snaking through the stone as if the city itself was splitting apart. A marketplace awning collapsed, sending goods spilling onto the ground. The people screamed, their voices rising in a deafening chorus of terror. "The city is falling," someone shouted. "We're doomed," another cried, their words echoing the fear that gripped every heart. Amidst the chaos, a solitary figure stood unmoved. Elisha, the prophet of the Lord, stepped onto the steps of the central courtyard, his robes billowing in the sudden gusts of wind that swept through the city. His face was calm, his eyes steady as they scanned the frightened crowd. Despite the trembling earth and the rising panic, he radiated an unshakable peace, a quiet strength that drew the attention of those around him. Slowly, the people began to turn toward him, their cries fading into uneasy silence as they looked to the prophet for answers. Elisha raised his hands, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Do not be afraid," he called out, his words strong and commanding. This is not a punishment from the Lord. This is a sign, a reminder of His power and His protection." The people hesitated, their fear momentarily overshadowed by the authority in His voice. Slowly, they began to gather around Him, their trembling hands clasped together in hope as they waited for Him to explain. Elisha's gaze swept over the crowd, his expression firm yet compassionate. "The Lord has delivered us today," he said, his voice steady despite the quaking earth beneath his feet. "He has shown His power over our enemies, not by our might, but by His. And now, He reminds us of His greatness, that we may never forget who it is that watches over us. This earthquake is not a curse, it is a declaration. A declaration that the God of Israel is greater than any king, any army, or any power on this earth." As the prophet spoke, the trembling began to subside, though the air still hummed with a quiet energy, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The people listened intently, their fear slowly giving way to awe as Elisha's words sank into their hearts. They looked around at the city, the cracked walls, the fallen stones, and began to see not destruction, but transformation. It was as though the very foundation of their lives had been shaken, not to destroy them, but to remind them of their dependence on the Lord. The final tremors echoed through the hills, and then, all was still. A profound silence fell over the city, broken only by the sound of quiet sobs and whispered prayers. Slowly, the people knelt where they stood, their heads bowed in reverence. Elisha joined them, his voice calm and reverent as he led them in a prayer of thanksgiving. "Lord," he said, his hands raised toward the heavens, "we thank You for Your mercy, for Your protection, and for the reminder of Your power. May we never forget that You are our shield, our refuge, and our strength in times of trouble." As the prayer ended, a sense of peace settled over the city. The people rose to their feet, their faces illuminated by a renewed sense of purpose and faith. They knew that they had witnessed something extraordinary, something that would be remembered for generations. This was not just an earthquake, it was a divine message, a call to recommit themselves to the God who had delivered them from their enemies and protected them in their darkest hour. Elisha turned to the elders of the city, his expression thoughtful. "Let this be a reminder to us all," he said, his voice filled with quiet authority. "The Lord's protection is not something we can take for granted. It is a gift, given not because of who we are, but because of who He is. And it is a call, to remain faithful, to walk in His ways, and to honor Him in all that we do." The elders nodded solemnly, their hearts heavy with the weight of His words. They understood now that the true strength of Israel did not lie in its walls or its armies, but in its faith and unity under the Lord's guidance. As the people dispersed to assess the damage and begin the work of rebuilding, a sense of determination filled the air. They knew that the cracks in their city and their hearts could be mended, not by their own strength, but by their faith in the God who had delivered them. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its warm light over the shaken city, the people of Samaria resolved to stand firm in their faith, knowing that no force on earth could shake the foundation of those who trust in the Lord. When the prayers were finished, Elisha rose to his feet and addressed the crowd once more. His voice, though gentle, carried a weight that seemed to press upon the hearts of everyone who heard it. "My brothers and sisters," he began, "today we have seen the might of the Lord, not only in the defeat of our enemies but in the shaking of the very earth beneath our feet. But do not mistake this display of power as merely a victory over our foes. It is something far greater, a message, a call, and a warning." The people listened intently, their eyes fixed on the prophet. "The Lord has protected us," Elisha continued, "but His protection is not unconditional. It is not given to us because of who we are, but because of who He is. And it is not simply a shield against our enemies, but a call to be faithful, to walk in His ways, and to honor Him in all that we do." His words resonated deeply, the weight of their meaning settling over the crowd like a heavy mantle. Elisha's gaze swept over the gathered Israelites, his expression serious but filled with compassion. "This earthquake," he said, gesturing to the cracked streets and crumbling walls, "is a reminder that we are not invincible. Our walls can fall, our gates can be breached, and our strength can fail. But the Lord is eternal. His power is unshakable. And as long as we remain faithful to Him, no force on earth can destroy us. The prophet paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. But let us not forget the lesson of this day. The greatest danger to Israel is not the armies of Aram or the might of foreign kings. It is the danger within, our own hearts, our own disobedience, and our own tendency to forget the God who has delivered us time and time again. Let this day be a turning point, a moment when we recommit ourselves to the Lord, not out of fear, but out of love and gratitude for His mercy. Tears welled in the eyes of many as they listened to Elisha's words. They thought of the betrayal from within, the cracks in their unity that had nearly cost them everything. They thought of the mercy that had been shown to them, both in their deliverance from the Arameans and in the restraint of the earthquake that had spared their lives. And they realized that this was not just a call to faith, it was a call to action, to rebuild not only their city but their relationship with God. Elisha concluded with a powerful declaration. Let us rebuild what has been shaken, stronger and more united than before. Let us cast out the seeds of division and plant the seeds of faith. For the Lord has shown us His power, and He has also shown us His mercy. May we never take it for granted. The crowd erupted into applause, their voices rising in agreement as they pledged to renew their covenant with the Lord. As the people dispersed to begin the work of rebuilding, a sense of purpose filled the air. The cracks in the walls and the rubble in the streets no longer seemed like signs of destruction, but symbols of renewal. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its light over the city, the people of Samaria knew that they were not alone. Their God was with them, and His hand would guide them as they moved forward in faith and unity. As the first light of dawn broke over the hills, the Aramean soldiers stumbled back toward their homeland. Their once proud army, which had marched to Samaria with such confidence and strength, was now a shadow of its former self. Their weapons were gone, their ranks broken, and their spirits crushed. The humiliation of their defeat weighed heavily on their shoulders, each step home a painful reminder of the power they had faced and could not overcome. Among them was the cunning commander who had once plotted the invasion of Samaria. His eyes, once filled with ambition, now carried a hollow emptiness. He had underestimated the God of Israel, thinking that strategy and strength alone could bring him victory. But now, he understood the truth: this was no ordinary enemy. The God of Israel was not bound by the limitations of men. He was a force beyond comprehension, a power that no army could stand against. When the soldiers finally reached the gates of Aram, their king was waiting. His face darkened as he saw the state of his once mighty army. Gone was the disciplined, battle-hardened force he had sent out. In its place was a defeated, demoralized group of men who could barely meet his gaze. What happened? He demanded, his voice sharp and filled with frustration. The commander stepped forward, his head bowed in shame. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice trembling, "we faced something we could not have prepared for. It was not the strength of their walls or their army that defeated us. It was their God. He is unlike anything we have ever encountered. His power is absolute." The king's anger slowly gave way to a deep, contemplative silence. He had heard of the God of Israel before, the stories of His miracles, His deliverance of His people. But he had dismissed them as mere legends, the exaggerated tales of a conquered nation. Now, standing before his broken army, he could no longer deny the truth. This God was real, and His power was undeniable. After a long pause, the king raised his hand. "No more," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "We will not fight Israel again. To do so would be to invite our own destruction. Let them worship their God in peace, for He is clearly with them." His words, though spoken quietly, carried a weight that settled over the court. The war was over. The cycle of conflict that had plagued both nations for so long had finally come to an end. For the first time in years, the people of Israel could look to the future with hope, knowing that the threat of Aram had been silenced by the power of their God. In Samaria, the news of the peace declaration spread quickly. The streets that had once been filled with fear and uncertainty were now alive with celebration. Families rejoiced, their voices rising in songs of thanksgiving. Elders gathered to share stories of the miracles they had witnessed, their words filled with awe and reverence. And in the midst of it all stood Elisha, his heart filled with gratitude for the God who had delivered them once again. "The Lord is our refuge and our strength," he said to the gathered crowd. "He is our shield and our fortress. Let us never forget His mercy and His power." As the celebrations continued, the people of Israel began to reflect on the events that had unfolded. The victories they had experienced, the miracles they had witnessed, were not just signs of God's power, they were lessons, meant to teach them about the dangers they faced both within and without. Elisha gathered the elders of the city and spoke to them, his voice calm but firm. "Let this be a lesson to us all," he began. "The greatest threat to Israel is not the armies of our enemies. It is the division within our own hearts. The betrayal we faced from our own people nearly cost us everything. We must remain vigilant, not only against the threats outside our walls, but against the seeds of discord that can grow within." The elders nodded, their faces thoughtful as they considered his words. They had seen firsthand the consequences of disunity and betrayal, and they knew that rebuilding trust within their community would be just as important as rebuilding the walls of their city. They resolved to work together, to strengthen the bonds of faith and unity that held their people together. "The Lord has shown us mercy," one elder said quietly. "Let us honor Him by standing united, as one people under His protection." Meanwhile, in the land of Aram, the defeated soldiers carried their own lessons home. The mercy they had been shown by the Israelites, the feast prepared for them, the decision to spare their lives, left a deep impression on many of them. They had come to Samaria expecting bloodshed, but instead, they had been met with kindness and forgiveness. It was a concept that many of them struggled to understand, but it planted a seed of change in their hearts. For the first time, they began to see that strength was not only found in weapons and armies, but in acts of compassion and mercy. Even the Aramean king, who had long been consumed by his ambition and pride, began to see things differently. As he sat in his throne room, listening to the reports of his soldiers, he found himself reflecting on the God of Israel. This God, who had shown both power and mercy, was unlike any deity he had ever known. Perhaps, he thought to himself, there is more to this God than we have understood. Perhaps His ways are not like ours. Though he did not fully comprehend it, a spark of humility began to take root in his heart, a small but significant shift that would shape his decisions in the years to come. For both Israel and Aram, the events of the past days left an indelible mark. The people of Israel learned that their greatest strength lay not in their walls or their weapons, but in their faith and unity. They understood that betrayal from within could be far more dangerous than any external threat, and they resolved to guard their hearts and their community with renewed vigilance. The Arameans, on the other hand, came to see that true power was not found in conquest, but in mercy. And though they returned to their land defeated, they carried with them a newfound respect for the God of Israel and the people who worshipped Him. In the end, the conflict between the two nations was not resolved through bloodshed, but through the miraculous intervention of the Lord and the lessons He imparted to both sides. Peace was restored, not just in the absence of war, but in the presence of understanding, humility, and faith. And as the people of Samaria knelt in prayer, their voices rising in a chorus of thanksgiving, they knew that they were not just celebrating the end of a war, they were celebrating the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope, unity, and the unwavering presence of their God. The story of Elisha and the siege of Samaria begins with what appears to be an insurmountable threat. The Aramean army, vast and powerful, surrounds the city, leaving no apparent way of escape. Panic takes hold of the people, and even Elisha's servant succumbs to despair. But amidst the fear and uncertainty, Elisha stands firm in his faith. He does not waver, even for a moment, because he knows that the God of Israel is greater than any army, any weapon, or any earthly power. Through his faith, Elisha shows us the importance of trusting in God, especially in the most desperate of circumstances. When his servant cries out in fear, Elisha does not respond with logic or strategy but with a prayer, "Lord, open his eyes so that he may see." And when the servant's spiritual eyes are opened, he beholds the reality of God's protection, a vast army of angels, their fiery chariots encircling the city. This moment serves as a powerful reminder that faith allows us to see beyond the immediate dangers and into the divine reality of God's presence and power. It teaches us that, even when we cannot see a way out, God is already at work, paving the path to victory. One of the most striking aspects of this story is the realization that God's protection is often unseen. The angelic army that surrounded Samaria had been present all along, but it was invisible to human eyes until Elisha prayed for it to be revealed. This unseen protection is a testament to the constant presence of God in the lives of his people. He is always there, even when we cannot perceive him, guarding us against dangers both seen and unseen. This truth is a source of immense comfort and hope. It reminds us that, no matter how isolated or vulnerable we may feel, we are never truly alone. God's protection is not limited by the constraints of the physical world. It is a divine shield that cannot be penetrated by the weapons of our enemies. And while we may not always be aware of his presence, we can trust that he is always watching over us, working behind the scenes to ensure our safety and deliverance. In a world where power is often equated with dominance and revenge, the actions of Elisha stand as a profound counterexample. When the Aramean army is struck with blindness and led into the heart of Samaria, the king of Israel sees an opportunity to destroy his enemies. "Shall I strike them down?" he asks eagerly, ready to exact vengeance. But Elisha's response is unexpected and deeply instructive. "No," he says. "Feed them and send them back to their master." This act of mercy transforms the narrative. Instead of perpetuating a cycle of violence and retaliation, Elisha chooses the path of kindness and forgiveness. By doing so, he demonstrates that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy but in the willingness to show compassion. This lesson resonates deeply, reminding us that the greatest victories are not those won on the battlefield but those won in the heart. It teaches us that mercy and forgiveness have the power to disarm even the fiercest enemies, creating opportunities for peace and reconciliation that violence could never achieve. While the Aramean army posed a significant threat to Samaria, it was the betrayal from within that nearly led to the city's downfall. The conspirators, lured by promises of wealth and power, sought to open the gates to the enemy, endangering the lives of their own people. This betrayal serves as a stark reminder that the greatest dangers often come not from outside forces but from within our own ranks. For Israel, this betrayal was a wake-up call. It highlighted the importance of unity and loyalty within their community. Elisha's response to the conspirators, exposing their actions and bringing them to justice, was not merely an act of punishment but a call to vigilance. It reminded the people of Samaria that their strength as a nation depended not only on their faith in God but also on their ability to trust and support one another. This lesson is as relevant today as it was then, urging us to guard against the seeds of division and betrayal that can weaken even the strongest communities. Throughout the story, the power of God is revealed in ways that defy human understanding. From the blindness that strikes the Aramean soldiers to the fiery chariots of the angelic army, and finally to the earthquake that shakes the very foundation of Samaria, each miracle serves as a testament to God's unmatched power. These supernatural events are not random acts of force, they are deliberate manifestations of His presence and authority, designed to teach and remind His people of who He is. But perhaps the most significant aspect of these miracles is what they reveal about the nature of God. They show that His power is not used to intimidate or oppress but to protect, deliver, and teach. The blindness of the Aramean soldiers leads not to their destruction but to their redemption. The fiery chariots inspire faith rather than fear. And the earthquake, though terrifying, serves as a call to reflection and renewal. These miracles remind us that God's power is always purposeful, always redemptive, and always for the good of His people. The story of Elisha's divine victories over the Aramean army is not just a tale of military success, it is a profound lesson in faith, trust, and the nature of God's protection. It teaches us to rely on the unseen, to choose mercy over vengeance, and to remain vigilant against threats both external and internal. Most importantly, it reminds us that all success and deliverance come from the Lord, whose power and presence are unmatched. As the people of Israel learned, the key to true peace and security lies not in walls or armies but in faith, unity, and unwavering trust in God.